Rain lashed against the cracked windows of an old diner on the edge of town, where Samuel Carter, a down-on-his-luck handyman, sat nursing a cold cup of coffee. Life hadn't been kind to Samuel. Years of hard work had left him with little more than calloused hands and an aching heart. He lived alone in a run-down trailer on the outskirts of the city, scraping by on odd jobs and the occasional act of kindness from strangers. That night, as the storm raged, Samuel finished his coffee and stepped into the biting wind. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders and began the long walk home. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the howl of the wind and the distant rumble of thunder. As he trudged through the darkened streets, his foot caught on something soft, and he stumbled. Looking down, he saw a small, tattered blanket covering what seemed to be a bundle of clothes. Curiosity and concern made him kneel, and when he pulled back the blanket, his heart stopped. Two small faces stared back at him, their wide eyes filled with fear and exhaustion. A boy, no older than 6, clutched a girl who couldn't have been more than 3. They were shivering, their lips blue from the cold. "Hey there," Samuel said softly, his voice cracking. "What are you two doing out here?" The boy didn't answer. Instead, he tightened his grip on the girl, shielding her from the rain with his frail arms. Samuel noticed their clothes were soaked through, their shoes barely holding together. His chest tightened. "It's okay," he said, taking off his coat and wrapping it around them. "You're safe now. Let's get you out of this rain." The boy hesitated, but finally allowed Samuel to pick up the little girl. She buried her face in Samuel's shoulder, her small body trembling. The boy followed closely, holding onto Samuel's sleeve as they made their way to his trailer. Inside, Samuel quickly lit a fire in the old wood stove, its warmth filling the small space. He dried the children off with a threadbare towel and gave them each a bowl of soup. The girl ate hungrily, but the boy's wary eyes never left Samuel. "What's your name?" Samuel asked gently. "Ethan," the boy replied after a long pause. "And she's Lily." "Where's your family?" Samuel pressed, though he already feared the answer. Ethan's eyes filled with tears, but he quickly wiped them away. "I don't know," he whispered. "Mommy said she'd be back, but she never came." Samuel's heart broke. He had seen his fair share of hardship, but nothing like this. He didn't know what kind of person could leave 2 children to fend for themselves, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't abandon them. Not now. As the storm continued to howl outside, Samuel set up a makeshift bed for Ethan and Lily. He watched them drift off to sleep, the firelight casting soft shadows on their faces. Questions swirled in his mind. Who were these children? Where was their mother? And why had she left them? He had no answers, but as he sat there in the quiet of the night, one thought became clear. His life had just changed forever. Little did he know, the journey he was about to embark on would uncover secrets that would test his resolve and shatter everything he thought he knew about love, loss, and redemption. The morning sun broke through the storm clouds, casting a warm glow over Samuel's modest trailer. The children were still asleep, their small bodies curled up on the makeshift bed. Samuel stood by the window, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. He had no experience with kids, no resources to care for them properly, but the thought of turning them over to strangers, or worse, the system, felt unbearable. As he made a pot of coffee, Ethan stirred awake. The boy's wary gaze met Samuel's, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. Then, as if gathering courage, Ethan spoke. "Are you going to take us away?" he asked, his voice trembling. Samuel shook his head. "No, son. Not unless that's what you want." Ethan's shoulders relaxed slightly, but his expression remained guarded. "We don't have anywhere to go," he admitted. "Then you'll stay here for now," Samuel said firmly. "But I'll need to know more. About you, your sister, and your mom. Maybe I can help." Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Over the next hour, bits and pieces of their story emerged. Their mother, Grace, had been struggling to make ends meet after their father's death. They had moved from place to place, always one step ahead of eviction notices and unpaid bills. Grace had grown increasingly desperate, and one night she had left Ethan and Lily in an alley, promising she'd return soon. That was 3 days ago. Samuel's jaw tightened as anger and sorrow churned inside him. How could someone abandon their children like that? But as he looked at Ethan, he realized the boy didn't need his judgment. He needed hope. "We'll figure this out," Samuel said, placing a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You have my word." Determined to learn more, Samuel decided to visit the alley where the children had been left. It was a seedy part of town, filled with boarded-up buildings and broken streetlights. As he searched for clues, he noticed a crumpled piece of paper tucked into the corner of a doorway. Picking it up, he saw it was a note, hastily written in smudged ink. "Forgive me. I have no choice. I'll come back for them. Grace." The note raised more questions than answers. What had driven Grace to leave her children? And why had she written as if she were in danger? Samuel's gut told him this was more than a case of neglect. Something deeper, darker, was at play. Back at the trailer, he showed Ethan the note. The boy's eyes filled with tears, and he clutched it tightly. "She didn't mean to leave us," he said, as if trying to convince himself. "I believe you," Samuel said. "But we need to find her. Do you remember anything that could help? A name? A place?" Ethan furrowed his brow, thinking hard. "She used to talk about someone named Mr. Hart. She said he could help her, but I don't know who he is." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Samuel's determination solidified. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he was prepared to do whatever it took to uncover the truth. For Ethan, for Lily, and for the mother who had vanished into the storm. Samuel spent the next few days making discreet inquiries about Mr. Hart. He spoke to neighbors, rummaged through old contacts, and even ventured into areas of the city he'd long avoided. His persistence paid off when an elderly woman at a local thrift shop recognized the name. "Mr. Hart," she said, her voice tinged with unease. "He's not someone you'd want to get involved with. Used to run a pawn shop downtown, but he's been known to deal in other things too." "Like what?" Samuel pressed. The woman hesitated before lowering her voice. "Desperate people go to him when they're out of options. Loans, jobs, sometimes worse. He doesn't come cheap, and he doesn't forgive debts easily." Samuel's stomach churned. If Grace had sought help from someone like Hart, it meant she'd been truly desperate. But why? And what had she gotten herself into? The address the woman provided led Samuel to a dilapidated pawn shop in the heart of the city. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and old metal. Behind the counter stood a wiry man with cold, calculating eyes. "I'm looking for Grace," Samuel said, trying to keep his voice steady. Hart's lips curled into a smirk. "A lot of people come looking for Grace. What's a she to you?" "She's in trouble," Samuel replied, "and I need to know what kind." Hart leaned forward, his expression darkening. "She owes me. And if you know what's good for you, you'll walk away. She made her choices." Samuel's fists clenched. "She has 2 kids who need her. Where is she?" Hart's smirk faded. He reached under the counter and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the counter. Inside were photos of Grace, looking gaunt and frightened. She tried to run. Last I heard, she was holed up at an old warehouse by the docks. But if you go after her, you're on your own. Determined, Samuel left the shop and made his way to the docks. The warehouse was abandoned, its windows shattered, and walls covered in graffiti. Inside, he found Grace huddled in a corner, her face streaked with tears. She looked up in shock as Samuel approached. "How did you find me?" she whispered. "Your kids," Samuel said simply. "They need you." Grace broke down, sobbing. Between gasps, she explained everything. After her husband's death, she'd fallen into debt trying to keep her family afloat. Hart had offered her a way out, but the cost had been too high. When she couldn't pay, he'd threatened to hurt her children. Desperate to protect them, she'd left them and gone into hiding. Samuel's heart ached for her. "It's not too late," he said. "Come back with me. We'll figure this out together." Grace hesitated, then nodded. Together, they returned to the trailer, where Ethan and Lily ran into their mother's arms, tears of relief streaming down their faces. For the first time in months, they were a family again. In the weeks that followed, life in Samuel's small trailer transformed into a flurry of activity. Grace, though fragile, threw herself into caring for Ethan and Lily, as if trying to make up for every moment she had lost. Samuel, true to his promise, helped them rebuild their lives piece by piece. The first challenge was dealing with Mr. Hart. Samuel knew the man wasn't the kind to let things go easily, and Grace's debt loomed like a shadow over their fragile peace. Samuel reached out to an old friend, Sheriff Hank Monroe, a no-nonsense lawman with a soft spot for justice. Hank had his suspicions about Hart's dealings, but lacked solid evidence to act. With Grace's testimony and the photos Samuel had taken from Hart's shop, Hank finally had the ammunition he needed. A raid on Hart's pawn shop uncovered records of illegal loans, coercion, and worse. Hart was arrested, and though the road to justice would be long, the immediate threat to Grace and her family was gone. Back at the trailer, the family settled into a routine. Samuel helped Grace find work at a local diner, and Ethan and Lily started attending a nearby school. The children, once wary and withdrawn, began to thrive in the warmth of stability. Ethan found joy in reading adventure books, while Lily's laughter echoed through the small home as she played with a patchwork doll Samuel had mended for her. For Samuel, their presence brought a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The trailer, once a lonely refuge, now felt alive. Dinners were filled with laughter and shared stories. Samuel discovered that Ethan had a knack for fixing things, and the two often worked side by side on small projects. Lily, with her boundless curiosity, became his shadow, asking endless questions about the world. Grace, too, began to heal. Though the guilt of her past choices lingered, she found strength in the love of her children and the unwavering support of Samuel. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, she turned to him. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "You saved us." Samuel shook his head. "No, Grace, you saved yourself by coming back for them. I just gave you a little push." She smiled, and for the first time in a long while, it reached her eyes. "Maybe, but we couldn't have done this without you." Months turned into a year, and the small family continued to grow stronger. Samuel's trailer expanded bit by bit as he added a room for the kids and patched up every leaky corner. Grace eventually saved enough to rent a modest house nearby, though they still spent most evenings together with Samuel, who had become an irreplaceable part of their lives. One day, while helping Ethan fix an old bicycle, Samuel paused. The boy was chattering about a science project he wanted to build, and Lily was busy drawing with chalk on the pavement. Grace stood nearby, hanging freshly washed clothes on a line, the sun catching her hair. Samuel realized something profound. His life, once defined by loneliness and struggle, had been transformed by these three. They had given him a reason to wake up each morning, to fight for something greater than himself. On the anniversary of their first meeting, Grace and the children surprised Samuel with a handmade plaque. It read, "To Samuel Carter, the man who gave us hope." Tears welled in his eyes as Ethan handed him the plaque. "You're our family now," the boy said simply. Samuel looked at them, his heart full. "And you're mine," he replied. As they stood together under the fading light of the day, Samuel knew this was his new beginning. For all the storms life had thrown at him, it had also given him something extraordinary, a second chance. Not just for himself, but for a family that had found its way to him on a rainy night. Together they would weather whatever came next, bound by the unshakable strength of love, hope, and the promise of brighter days ahead. Join us on Stories of Brilliance, where every tale inspires greatness. Like, share, and subscribe to keep the brilliance alive.